The French government announces measures to fight domestic violence. It comes after tens of thousands of people took to the streets of Paris over the weekend calling for an end to gender violence and femicide. Celebrations break out in Hong Kong as pro-democracy leaders take nearly 90% of the seats following district council elections. The results have been labelled a democratic tsunami. And documents obtained by the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists detail the Chinese state is locking up ethnic minorities in secret, this in the hopes of rewiring people's thoughts and even the language they speak. We'll be crossing live to our correspondent Charles Pellegrin in Beijing for the latest. Thank you very much for joining us here on France 24. Today is the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women. It's also the day the French government announced measures to end gender violence and femicide. This in a country where 116 women have been killed by current or former partners this year alone. Here's what the French Prime Minister Edouard Philippe announced earlier.
The government will dedicate over €1 billion next year to policies promoting greater equality between men and women. This includes €350 million for the fight against domestic violence over 1 year. The funds are here. They are massive. They will help victims and those who assist them. There is no lack of money.
Story we can bring in Annette Young, host of France 24's 51%. Annette, you just heard there from the Prime Minister, there is no shortage of funds. Will throwing money at the problem help?
Well, certainly if you talk to women's groups, they're not happy on the ground because they argue that just to deal with femicide and gender-based violence alone, you need somewhere in the order of €1 billion. Having said that, the Prime Minister said that somewhere around 350 million plus, I think, is going to be allocated to dealing with this issue. They are certainly ramping it up as a major priority in their gender equality approach. They're talking about prioritising police training, about formally recognising psychological violence as being domestic violence. They're talking about seizing firearms from people who've already been suspected of domestic violence. They're talking about overhauling the judicial system, making it more streamlined so that they can deal with cases much more quickly. The greater use of electronic bracelets in order to prevent domestic violence offenders from reapproaching their victims. They're also talking for family court judges to be allowed to suspend the visitation rights of separated fathers who attack or threaten their ex-partners, and, training frontline responders to the point that easing up the difficulties that exist now. For instance, people working in hospitals, doctors, nurses, who are often some of the first people to witness evidence of domestic violence but are not in the position to actually pursue any complaints or alert other people or other officials about it. So that's going to be looked at as well. And they're talking about gender equality programs in schools so that effectively they stress the need to educate boys to challenge that very deeply rooted inequality and social norms that perpetuate men's control and power over women and reinforce tolerance for violence against women and girls.
Now, Annette, one of the words you use and I've used is femicide. What exactly is femicide?
It is a very interesting word in that it's fairly new in the English language vocabulary. Let me just now throw up this definition, which is femicide is the killing of a woman or girl, most likely by a man or on account of her gender. Now, it's not yet recognised in French criminal law. Many advocate groups, including UN Women, are actively seeking to change that, especially as a result of these government new measures. A little bit of history. The word was first coined by South African feminist and researcher Diana Russell back in the 1970s. 40 years on, it's still yet to be recognised in many countries' legal codes, and it's not widely used. I mean, the fact, when you talk to people about murder and you say femicide, there's a sort of bit of a blank look. We all know the word homicide, of course, but we don't know the word femicide. But in recent years, that's starting to change. For instance, in Latin America, which is home to 14 out of the 25 most dangerous countries for women, a women's group called Ni Una Menos, not one more, or not one less rather, who's a group which has been very much advocating to deal with femicide, has made it very much part of the local lingo, if you like, and part of the national discussion. And as a result, Argentina, Colombia, and at least 14 other Latin American countries have passed law that now define and punish femicide for being a specific crime. There are different types of femicide too. I mean, there's that committed by a spouse or an ex-spouse. There are honour killings in India, murder linked to dowries. Now, that's not necessarily something that's carried out by men. A lot of times it's carried out by both women and men in the groom's family who believe they can kill a woman because a dowry is insufficient. And of course, there's also murder committed by a stranger. But, you know, as I say, there's big push now across the globe for all countries to recognise the word, to get it part of the legal code as such.
It's funny how there's a lot of work to be done, not just in countries like India, but even here in France as well. And I thank you very much for that. In other news, a pro-democracy camp in Hong Kong appeared to have won a resounding victory following district council elections over the weekend. The city's leader, Carrie Lam, said her government would respect the result and listen to the people. Pro-democracy leaders, meanwhile, have been calling the vote a democratic tsunami.
Local elections in Hong Kong are usually a sleepy affair. 4 years ago, only 41% of voters bothered to turn out. But with the island territory gripped with mass protests, unhappy with Chief Executive Carrie Lam and her pro-Beijing government, the elections became a de facto referendum on her rule.
Remarkable achievement in the district council election is the efforts of all Hong Kongers, especially voters, protesters, or hardline frontliners that pay the price, spend the time, or even sacrifice in the protest movement.
Turnout soared to 71%, with pro-democracy candidates to win majorities in at least 17 of Hong Kong's 18 districts. The biggest loser of the night was the territory's pro-Beijing camp. The party fielded 182 candidates, but only 27 of them were elected.
Maybe with regards to the work of the pro-Beijing establishment, there was no response to the people that wanted political change. So there were people that were even more keen to vote. A lot of young people came out to vote. This I am sure of.
Local elections are Hong Kong's only fully democratic vote. Members of the legislature are chosen partly by universal suffrage, whilst others are elected by people who work in certain industries. A key demand of the protest movement is that Hong Kongers be given fully free and fair elections. However, such a change would be strongly resisted in Beijing, which views the protest movement as a threat to its authority over the territory.
A series of leaked classified documents reveal how Beijing is locking up ethnic minorities, mainly Uyghur Muslims. In the past, the Chinese government said the detained were being housed in voluntary job training centers, but papers obtained by the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists show the centers, which are run in secret, are designed to rewire people's thoughts and the language they speak. For more on this story, we can go across to France 24's Charles Pellegrin standing by in Beijing. Charles, we've known that these centres existed, but what new details does this leak tell us?
Well, this leak provides a new level of insight as to how these camps are being managed. One of these documents is basically a directive within the ranks of the ruling party explaining how the camps should be operated, explaining that there should be 24/7 surveillance, whether video or human, monitoring all the detainees, even talking about not having any blind spots in classrooms, dormitories, or even bathrooms. There's also a lot of talk of isolation from the outside world, except for extremely monitored interactions with relatives. There's also the question of secrecy. All the people who work in the camps as guards are sworn to secrecy, not revealing what happens inside these camps. Also, another interesting insight as to how these camps are operated is that there's a scoring system for the detainees where they're classified in 3 different categories depending on how their dangerous or not. This, of course, depending on the point of view of the authorities and depending on whether or not they've made their ideological transformation into a obedient citizen of Beijing. And finally, what's interesting here as well is this was leaked from within the Chinese Communist Party ranks, which could suggest that there's a little bit, that there's some level of dissent about this particular campaign in China.
Charles, thank you very much for that update. Charles Pellegrin reporting there for us from Beijing. That's where we leave it. Thank you very much for watching.